if your freedom is dependent upon you having the facts to make informed choices, which is the premise of democracy, then if you're organized crime trying to operate at scale, then what you want to do is dominate those in-between domains. Wolf Blitzer on CNN being a classic case in point. Judith Miller at the New York Times, again, being a classic case in point. I called the book Guilt by Association because if you're waging war in the shared field of consciousness, that's where a consensus resides, is in that shared field. It's sort of a belief that we share, but you can't really touch, smell, or see that domain. If you're shaping that consensus beliefs, the way this criminality operates at scale is the people that are the criminals in this operation are very masterful at displacing facts with what the targeted populace can be induced to believe is true. You remember Iraqi ties to Al-Qaeda. Remember Iraq was having meetings in Prague with Taliban. You remember the yellow cake uranium from Niger. You remember the mobile biological weapons laboratories. You remember the weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein had. If you look back, all of those were false. Yet we had a consensus that they were true. That is how organized crime operates at scale now. It displaces the facts essential for informed choice with pre-cooked intelligence to have you embrace certain beliefs that in this case took us to war in the Middle East. So that's organized crime operating at a global scale. That's how it operates, displacing facts with what the mark, meaning the United States populace, could be induced to believe is true. So the scope of this criminality, and I think that's the right phrase for it, is substantial. If you can imagine, for example, embedding in a shared field of consciousness, where does this consensus reside? That indeed Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, all the sorts of intelligence we know were fixed to take us to war in Iraq. At what level does this criminality have to operate in order to deceive at least a critical mass of people in the Congress and in the general population that we go along with this and say, yes, of course, we believe in all this, therefore let's go to war in Iraq, which of course had absolutely nothing, as we now know, to do with 9/11. So what's the scale at which this operates? Very large scale. That's why this syndicate needed to really have a critical mass of dominance in what we call mainstream media and other key in-between domains. If you're trying to have a form of governance based on facts versus what you can be induced to believe, then you need to dominate those in-between domains. You need to have a substantial critical mass of influence, and primarily in media, print media, but also the visual media, particularly the networks, in order to induce us to believe things that simply were not true. So what is the scope of this? The scope is vast. The scope is very large. The only thing I can identify in this modus operandi, and again, the modus operandi as a Latin term means the method of operating, is how do you displace facts, the facts essential for informed choice, with beliefs, fictions, to have the mark, the target, a targeted populace, sincerely believe that these things are true, sufficiently true that we would expend our blood and treasure. We would put our youth in our military. We would deploy our military on behalf of this fiction. So who would have the capacity to do that, and who would have the state of mind to do that, other than a criminal syndicate? And that's why I call this a criminal syndicate. Some people call this Zionism. I think it's frankly more sinister than that. How do you get the nation, the world's largest superpower, to go to war for you, for your agenda, to advance your expansionist agenda? How do you do that? That's game theory. Let's talk for a minute about assets and how they operate in the political domain. John McCain is a classic what we call asset, and that's, again, there's a terminology here that you need to be familiar with to understand how criminality can operate in plain sight, yet non-transparently, and so far with legal impunity. An asset is someone who's been profiled in sufficient depth that if you put them in a time, place, and circumstance, you know within an acceptable range of probabilities that they will perform consistent with their personality profile. That's called an asset. To some extent, we're all assets, but political operatives like a John McCain, you need to know that they'll perform within an acceptable range of, probabilities. He is a classic asset. I live in Tempe, Arizona, which was a congressional district created in part to help run him for Congress 4 years before an earlier maverick, Barry Goldwater, was known to be planning his retirement. But John McCain, his background, and it's in guilt by association, his background requires a little bit of explanation. There's a fellow named Gus Greenbaum who was sent out to Arizona in 1928. In 1947, a fellow named Bugsy Siegel, who was widely known as an operative, was killed by Murder Inc., which is the enforcement arm of organized crime, because he was caught skimming the casino skim. And you may remember Virginia Hill, his dancer friend, better known as Flamingo, was her dance name. There was a casino there called the Flamingo, which Bugsy named after his Virginia Hill, a famous story in sort of mobster lore. When Bugsy was murdered, they need someone to replace him in Las Vegas. That became Gus Greenbaum. He moved to Las Vegas in 1947 to take over from Bugsy. But then the mob needed someone to replace Bugsy Siegel. That was a fellow named Kemper Marley, who in effect had a statewide liquor monopoly that came largely from the Bronfman family, the founders of the World Jewish Congress, out of Ontario. They were the primary importers of booze during the Prohibition. Kemper Marley, in effect, got that liquor monopoly from the Bronfman family. Kemper Marley became the replacement for Gus Greenbaum. He hired two fellows, both named Hensley. James Hensley and his brother, in effect, took the fall. They took the heat for two federal liquor violations that Kemper Marley otherwise would have been prosecuted for. In that process, James Hensley came into the ownership of an Anheuser-Busch distributorship, which is now the 5th largest beer distributorship in the United States. Cindy Hensley, his daughter, 18 years John McCain's junior. If you understand John McCain and know what an asset is, if you got this Cindy Hensley in John McCain's neighborhood, you knew within an acceptable range of probability that the sparks would fly. And sure enough, John McCain ends up divorcing his wife, moving to Arizona, and becoming a public relations person for Hensley Distributors, the beer distributorship. With that, he works himself into politics and is run for the Congress in '81. 4 years later is run for the Senate. He's 82 to the Congress, I guess. 4 years later comes into the Senate as a perfect asset. When Cindy meets him, he is a Navy liaison to the Senate. He's already gone to Israel with Richard Pearl and this other crowd who by then profiled him as a classic, a very reliable and pliable asset. So John McCain, again, an absolute classic asset. It's hard to find a more classic asset than John McCain, with the possible exception of John Kyle, who is the Christian Zionist, again from Arizona, again a state that's been widely dominated by organized crime for a very long time. That's why Janet Napolitano is now head of Homeland Security. Again, a very reliable sort of asset from a state that has been dominated by organized crime since no later than the 1920s. So that's John McCain. Keep in mind that he proposed campaign finance reform as a way to recover his reputation when he was the primary advocate for what was known as the Keating Five, which was a group that was helped delay the reform of the savings and loan fraud of the late 1980s. That delay helped raise the cost of that financial fraud from $100 billion to about $150 billion. So we have John McCain and his colleagues to thank for that as well. That's John McCain. In the book, I cover the attack on the USS Liberty, which is an intelligence ship which in June of 1967 was attacked and savaged by the Israeli Air Force, the Israeli Navy. It was covered up by Lyndon Johnson and John McCain's father, who was then the admiral with oversight of that particular region. So it's sort of, like father, like son. Had that not been covered up in 1967, we would not consider Israel to be the ally that we've been induced to believe that it is, despite the facts. So again, I won't get into that now, but it's in the book. There's a long chapter on the USS Liberty. No matter how honest you are as a politician, you are disabled by your own biases, okay? And you're disabled by the intelligence on which you rely. In the case of George W. Bush, recovering alcoholic, so you got that thing about an outer authority, give your life up to an outer authority, which immediately makes you vulnerable. You've got, he's out of sorts with his father, who's a pretty smart guy, so he's not talking to his father, who had a lot of background that would have been useful for him to have in making these decisions. You're surrounded by this crowd. You're a Christian Zionist. You're a born-again Christian. So you've got a substantially long list of personality profile characteristics, whereby you know that if some emotionally wrenching event like a 9/11 occurs, you know within an acceptable range of probabilities, particularly based on the fixed intelligence funneled into the decisions, what the decision is going to be. That's game theory. People routinely ask about 9/11 and what was its role in this scenario that is laid out in Criminal State. I said, if you've got 1.3 billion Muslims worldwide, roughly, you've got 6 decades of abuse and indignities heaped upon Muslims, particularly in Palestine, but elsewhere, by an enclave of extremists who are viewed as an ally of the United States. We routinely arm them. We veto resolutions to discipline them in the UN. We are seen as a loyal ally of the what people call the State of Israel. Is it difficult with an agent provocateur model that is that spans decades? How difficult would it be to get a critical mass of people enough upset at us that they would make a point? And if you're trying to, with that point, provoke a provocation, then what better thing to do than to hit some iconic buildings such as the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, something like that, knowing within an acceptable range of probabilities that we're likely to respond by going to war. And once you have that provocation in place, how difficult is it to fix the intelligence so that instead of mobilizing, say, a police action to go after Al-Qaeda, to arrest or kill those who were complicit in this, instead go as a nation to war against Iraq, which had nothing to do with this. So that's another sort of, when you're understanding how game theory works and game theory war planning, particularly when you have multi-generational agent provocateur operations underway, is that an explanation of 9/11? Well, all I can do is sort of report the facts and let people draw their own conclusions, but those are the facts. The goal of the Criminal State series, beginning with guilt by association, is to help people understand how facts can be displaced with fictions, with beliefs, in plain view. And one great example of that is the deployment of Colin Powell to the UN to testify to the veracity of Iraq having mobile biological weapons laboratories. Now, that was done in February 2005, just before the invasion. And when you were looking at Colin Powell, you thought you were looking at Colin Powell. You weren't really. What was being deployed there was the credibility of Colin Powell. When you're waging war in this sort of shared field of consciousness, you're always deploying the properties that are embedded in that field. In this particular case, you were associating Colin Powell's credibility with this fixed, false, and phony intelligence, which is mobile biological weapons laboratories. By associating his credibility with this fixed intelligence, you have what's called in psychology a bleed over. Suddenly you took his credibility and that made this fixed intelligence appear credible. So that's how you wage war in the field of consciousness, with the power of association. Another example, in May of 2005, there was a cricket player by the name of Imran Khan, a Pakistani. Newsweek, it's the Washington Post magazine founded by Eugene Meyer, bought it out of bankruptcy in '33. Newsweek published an article about a fellow named David Ishakoff, who claimed that U.S. troops and interrogators flushed a Koran down the toilet. That's considered sacrilege in Islam. Now, Newsweek retracted that story 10 days later, saying it was insufficiently documented. So what happened was Imran Khan somehow was induced to step out and announce that the United States had desecrated a Koran. Now, when Imran Khan says it, it'd be like a Hank Aaron or a baseball or a football star saying it in the United States. You took the field-based quality of Imran Khan, his celebrity, and you use that as a weapon in the same way you use the credibility of Colin Powell. By deploying Imran Khan's celebrity, you breached the literacy barrier. When he said it, that story went viral in Muslim nations worldwide. It reached tens of millions of people because a celebrity said it. So when you're waging field-based warfare, this is where this is being waged. It's not in a tangible battlefield. It's in the field, the shared field of consciousness. So that's where you deploy intangible properties in that field. Credibility, celebrity, those types of things. And that's how you wage warfare. In plain sight, you can't really quite see it. And that's how this works. Who in this operation, and it is an operation, has the skill set with which to embed, to really shape a consensus, a shared state of mind, a shared mindset in such a fashion that we would, believe in something that's not true. When trying to grasp the scope of this sort of what I call belief-based criminality, the sort of a faith-based organized crime, I have faith that if we simply let financial markets work their will worldwide, then everything will be fine. We'll have orchids blooming in the sewers. Everything's, I've advised in 35 countries, usually the finance minister, the prime minister, in the unwinding of public ownership to private ownership, what we used to think of as Marx to sort of, Milton Friedman or Adam Smith, that sort of thing. And what we found is uniformly what happened as we came out of state ownership, we ended up creating these oligarchies. Everywhere you look, the Russian oligarchs being an obvious case in point. And when Russia came out of that highly dysfunctional sort of system, suddenly you look back, and as I worked there with Gorbachev's first economic team, brief Yeltsin within a few weeks of him being sworn in, I sensed somehow the fix was in, but it was not until I took on this particular task that I realized on whose behalf and how. And that's what we're trying to get people to see. But for example, in the unwinding of Marx in the former Soviet Union, by the time the oligarchs came into their own, 6 of the top 7 oligarchs qualified for Israeli citizenship. In a country like the United States that's less than 2% Jewish, how can you have 84% of these oligarchs having that similar ethnic background? So what really was going on here? If you look back into part of my personal history, was being there for what we call supply side economics, brought to us by Ronald Reagan. I was Finance Committee counsel from 80 to 1987, so I saw that up close and personal. And what it was guaranteed to do financially, and there's a chapter about that in the book, it was guaranteed to make the rich far, far richer. And now if you look back and look at the dominant ethnicity of the Forbes 400, it's very similar to what we have in Russia. So you go back through this and you begin to say, well, how did we adopt a mindset where we thought that money really should be the compass by which we guide the nation? How did that happen? How did that get embedded in education? How did I myself embrace that? I'm the son of a Chicago-educated PhD in economics, trained in economics, trained in law. By the time I show up as Finance Committee counsel, I've got this sort of consensus frame through which I view my world. How did that happen? And that's what the book is about. It's about trying to give people a broader perspective to see that they themselves are part of the problem, because we've all been educated into this same frame through which we see our world. And unfortunately, the United States we're now branded with that. We now look like we are part of the problem, which we are, because we've taken that frame and we've insisted that people draft the laws in their own countries to embrace that money myopic, finance-fixated frame in which you're guaranteed to create oligarchies, you're guaranteed to undermine democracies, you're guaranteed to impair genuine markets. That's how organized crime operates at scale, like that. You know, where did this come from? How did we get to this point? Well, if you go back, there's a book that was published in 1996 called The Clash of Civilizations by a Harvard professor named Samuel Huntington. But like most things, there's a history to this. In the case of the Clash did not begin with Samuel Huntington. He published an article in Foreign Affairs in 1993 that became the book in 1996. But before that, Bernard Lewis, who was a Zionist, interesting fellow, branded himself as an Islamic scholar. He is one that really gave that theme to Samuel Huntington. By the time it migrated through Foreign Affairs and then into a best-selling book by Huntington, how did it become a best-selling book, and how did this clash of civilizations become a consensus, a widely held belief, right? Well, it happened because by the time Huntington released that book, there were over 100 non-governmental organizations, the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute. Just go down the list of, people with enormous amount of budget, enormous amount of media exposure, who said this is the new consensus, the clash of civilizations. And you might have noticed how seamlessly we segued from the Cold War to the clash of civilizations. Some of you will remember the peace dividend. What happened to the peace dividend? The Cold War is over and suddenly we're in a clash of civilizations. Where did this come from? Did we just suddenly start hating Muslims? Did Muslims just suddenly start hating Americans? I mean, where did this come from? So you have a period of preparing the mind, launching the clash of civilizations in 1996. 2001, you get the emotionally wrenching attack on the United States, and emotion plays a big role in this because emotion is a well-known way to displace facts. Because when people are emotionally aroused, emotionally upset, particularly when they're angry, they're more willing to respond viscerally. And if you have a pre-staged evildoer like a Saddam Hussein, who everyone knows is an evildoer, then suddenly it becomes plausible that he is where we need to go take out Saddam Hussein, who was an evildoer, had something to do with 9/11. We now know that was a total fiction, but it doesn't matter. Now we're at war in the Middle East. Who would have the means, the motivation, the opportunity, and importantly, who would have the stable nation-state intelligence to embed that kind of operation inside that country? That is who the criminal syndicate is. People ask how did this criminal syndicate gain so much control, for example, over the U.S. Congress, over the office of the presidency. And it's really a matter of mathematics. If you understand, if the book really has a summary on that right in the introduction. How did McCain-Feingold, as it was called a campaign finance reform. It was anything but that. In effect, what it did was raise the limits that individuals can give to campaigns. And if you understand how campaign finance really works, let me give you an example. McCain-Feingold increased the dollar amount that individuals could give from $1,000 to $2,300 per person per election, both the primary and the general election. So if you're a couple, you can give $2,300 in the primary, another $2,300, individual $2,300 in the primary, $2,300 in the general. If you're a couple, that's $4,600. So effect, an individual family, a husband, wife, can give $9,200 to a candidate. Now, if you take the way Washington really works, is you have what's called bundlers. For example, if I pass the beauty contest, as it's called, for the Israel lobby, they will call a bundler on my behalf, and they'll say, this person has passed the beauty contest, go out and raise money for them. So the bundler will himself contribute, and his wife, or other way around. they will then call 10 other bundlers. If you do the math, you end up with each of those is 11 times $9,200. So you end up with over $1 million with literally just one phone call. From, again, the Israel lobby gives you the phone number of the contact of this one person, and suddenly you've got $1 million to run a campaign. And some of the smaller districts, congressional districts, that's enough to run a credible campaign, or at least certainly enough to get a campaign kick-started. So that's how the Israel lobby embedded themselves into congressional campaigns. They then focused on not only grooming candidates, but also making sure that once they're in the Congress, that they groom them for seniority, and then also opposing people who would oppose the Israel agenda being the primary agenda of the U.S. And so if you combine all those things, you get an enormous force multiplier. If you understand that although there's over 450 members of Congress, 452, only about 10% of those are competitive in any given year, 30 to maybe 50. So if you then concentrate your money on the competitive races, it's another force multiplier. So people ask, how could those who are so few have such influence? Well, it's a matter of numbers. You concentrate your resources on competitive races. You make sure that people who are looking to run for office, you make sure you give them a lot of money early on. You get them embedded in the system. You get them embedded to your agenda. And if you do that for long enough, and this crowd has been doing this for several decades now, you have an enormous amount of influence in the Congress. And you do the same thing on the presidential side, and that, again, is detailed in the books. And suddenly the force multiplying effect is quite extraordinary. George W. Bush, again, a classic asset, as was John McCain, an absolute classic asset. But George Bush came out of, he was a brand name politician. If you watched politics very closely in 2000, the syndicate that is being chronicled and profiled in these accounts, in the span of about 6 weeks, raised about $50 million for this brand name politician, George W. Bush, a former governor. $50 million. In effect, the Republican primary was preempted. By the time the nominating convention came along, it was a fait accompli. This was going to be the nominee. Once you do that, you begin to fill in in Washington we used to call it the plum book. It literally was a plum. I think it's a different color now. But it's the 3,000 to 6,000 positions that are filled in by the lead of the executive branch, the undersecretary, the deputy assistant secretary, all these positions that are filled in. So once you got the nominee and you got the election well underway, you begin to look in that book and you put your people in the small, narrow part of the funnel for information going into the White House for decision making. For example, you don't need to be the head of the CIA. You can set up your own intelligence operation called the Office of Special Plans in the Pentagon, run by a fellow named Douglas Feith, and you can cook your own intelligence, send it in through the Deputy Defense Secretary, Paul Wolfowitz, in through the Vice President's office, where a fellow named Scooter Libby would take it directly into the decision-making process. That's only 3 people. Okay, so that's how you begin to take game theory, how you begin to take this and put it on the ground, so you can begin to manipulate the intelligence. Well, it's difficult, and indeed, I don't go to motivation of those who've done this. I go to the how that it was done. I'll let the readers and the viewers in this case make up their own mind about why someone would do this. But what we do know is that we have an enclave of extremists in the Middle East that we embraced as an ally, and indeed we extended nation-state recognition to them in 1948, which we're finding now was a key strategic mistake. And it was particularly a mistake for moderate and secular Jews who embraced this notion, who rejected the notion in 1948, but now tend to embrace it because they've been led to believe if this enclave is somehow threatened, that they themselves are threatened, which is not all the case, but they've been led to believe that. But if you are an enclave of extremists and elitists, and you have an expansionist agenda in mind, When Harry Truman extended nation-state recognition to this enclave, he was advised by Secretary of State, then George Marshall, who in effect oversaw the winning of the Second World War. He said, whatever you do not do this. The Joint Chiefs of Staff came to him and said, look, this is a group of fanatics who seek hegemony. They seek dominance in the Middle East. Do not do this. The Central Intelligence Agency advised not to do this. The diplomatic corps said, whatever you do not do this. He was advised routinely to not do this, and he did it anyway. It has been uniformly a mistake, and it's been primarily not only a mistake of the United States, but it's been a huge mistake for moderate and secular Jews who were concerned that this was going to be a problem, and it has become an enormous and growing problem. And in effect, we've deployed our blood and treasure at the behest of those who've manipulated us from the inside. No better case than in the cooking of the intelligence that took us to war in Iraq. But that is ongoing. It appears that the next, quote, evildoer will be Pakistan. Now there's an ongoing onslaught of, again, cooked intelligence in an attempt to take us, again, to broaden this war into Iran or perhaps into Pakistan. So that's, why would someone do this? Well, it's people who think they're, somehow chosen, I suppose, somehow have the right to operate above the law, and that is a good description of this enclave of extremists to whom we extended nation-state status.